guys. It's a little bit earlier than our normal videos, but with me is probably one of my favorite authors now. I've read this book, Mr. Paul Copan. The name of the book is God a Moral Monster? And I actually bought this two ways. I bought the hardback, or sorry, I should say the paperback, and I bought it on Audible because it's just chocked full of information, from your thoughts on new atheism to dissecting chunks of the Old Testament. I guess first initial question is, what kind of made this be your field and wanting to write on these particular issues?
Well, I have a background in biblical studies and theology, so undergrad and master's level work. So Greek, Hebrew, and so that's been my underpinning to launch into this. But it was really after September 11th and the New Atheists books coming out and making statements about the God of the Old Testament being the most unpleasant character in all fiction, as Richard Dawkins says. And so I looked at some of the new atheists and what they were saying about the Old Testament, and I thought, well, let me offer a little bit of a rebuttal to some of the things that they're saying and put some things in context. And so that led to an article that was published in the Journal for the Evangelical Philosophical Society called Philosophia Christi, called Is Yahweh a Moral Monster? And then that turned into the book Is God a Moral Monster? That came out in 2011. And then because of the issue of violence, warfare in the Old Testament, Matthew Flanagan, a fellow philosopher, theologian, and we teamed up to write the book, Did God Really Command Genocide? So that's an extensive, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach to the topic of warfare, just war, the Crusades, theology, the biblical studies components, even international law. So we looked at that, and then I have done a lot of work in light of the questions that I've gotten, engagements that I've had with people to talk about this Old Testament, these Old Testament challenges that in fact, I just finished it 2 days ago. I sent off the book to the publisher called Is God a Vindictive Bully? And it looks at the subtitle is Reconciling the Portrayals of God in the Old and New Testaments. And so I look at touch on some of what I call the critics from without the Christian faith, and then there are critics from within the Christian faith who see that there is apparently a vast discrepancy between the God of the Old Testament, or what they would say the textual God, the God of the fallen Old Testament prophet who was violence prone and sinful and embedded within his own ancient Near Eastern context, so that when it says the Lord says, or thus says the Lord, drive out the Canaanites, that's just Moses or Joshua. That's not what God really said. That's not the actual God, who is kind of pacifistic, if you will, nonviolent. God is, compassionate, etc. So God doesn't actually engage in any sort of coercive force. He withdraws his presence, and then humans or demonic agents rush in to fill that void. So I push back on those critics from within, people like Greg Boyd and Peter Enns and others. So anyway, that's the book that's I'm just working on. So it's kind of phase 3 of my the development of this process. So I look at things like the imprecatory Psalms, Elisha and the bears, the issue of God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, or the firstborn of Egypt being slain, to other issues like, how do we understand the Old Testament law? Was it dropped from heaven? Was it influenced by other ancient Near Eastern law traditions? And how does the Mosaic law and the worldview behind it differ from the other ancient Near Eastern law collections. And I just spent 2 chapters on looking at the contrast, the big worldview contrasts between those, and then look at other issues related to Leviticus 25 and the servitude passage there. I look at the issues of, I revisit some issues on warfare and add new material on that topic, and what does harem, utter destruction, mean, etc. So I look into that, and so that's the overview of what I'm covering in this forthcoming book.
No, that's very cool. And one more time, what was the name of this future coming book, and is there an ETA when we can expect it?
Right. Well, it should probably be 6 to 9 months before it's out. So it'll be out sometime in 2022. It's called Is God a Vindictive Bully? Like the Moral Monster book, I got that title from Richard Dawkins. And then it's the sub. So Is God a Vindictive Bully? And the subtitle is Reconciling Portrayals of the God of the Old and New Testaments.
No, fantastic. And as we were talking about going live, I had a few questions from some friends who have also read your material, and they wanted your thoughts on Numbers 31.
Okay. Yeah, Numbers 31, of course, is the follow-up to what happened in Numbers 25, where the Midianite women, through the instigation of the pagan prophet Balaam, and again, it didn't work for the Moabite king to have Balaam curse the nation of Israel. And so basically this is a subversive way of having the Israelites, in a sense, curse themselves, bring the covenant curses upon themselves through idolatry and sexual immorality. So these women were involved in seduction, leading the Israelite men in particular into idolatry. And basically, it was a covenant breaking ceremony. So they joined themselves to Baal, so a pagan deity, and broke covenant with the Lord. And so after that, a covenant renewal ceremony was necessary while they're in Moab. But chapter 31 looks at the follow-up of that, and this is kind of as things are wrapping up in the book of Numbers, a few more chapters, but this is kind of a dramatic incident. And so it says that Moses, the Lord commanded the Israelites to go and utterly destroy to kill all the adult males in battle. And so they end up doing that. And so they've carried out that commandment. Then here's the question. Moses says, well, what about these women? And then says, kill the women who've had been involved in this seduction, and also the boys too. So this raises questions. Well, if the command was already fulfilled, then is there part 2 here? And so some scholars have wondered, and I think there's merit to it, that this is kind of Moses tacking this on after the job had been completed that the Lord had commanded, and so that's one side of it. And it's kind of like what Nathan told David, the prophet Nathan. He said, "Go ahead and build the temple, and the Lord bless you." And then the Lord speaks to Nathan and says, "No, David's not going to build the temple. His son is going to build the temple because David was a man of bloodshed and warfare." So he had to retract that blessing, that word, kind of off the cuff word. And some scholars see what Moses was doing as kind of an off the cuff remark as well. Now, there are other things that also make this a little bit murky. Now, if, let's say, you've basically obliterated all the Midianites, if you've wiped out the women, the boys, the women, young girls are perhaps assimilated into Israel, and then the male, the army, the males have been utterly destroyed, as it were. You have the mention of them, the Midianites, in full force in Judges 6 verse 5, where the Midianites are like the sands of the seashore, and even their camels couldn't be numbered. So there's this, all of a sudden, a generation later, there they all are, arrayed again in battle against the Israelites. So, and then you have at the end of Numbers 31 that there wasn't even an Israelite fatality. And one of the things that I point out, and I go into more detail on this chapter in my Moral Monster book, is that there are a lot of indicators that where women are mentioned, where like women and children and so forth, there's kind of a sweeping statement made that you don't even have to have women around in order for that insertion to be put into place. And so I give an example of going back to Numbers 21, where these two kings, Og and Sihon, don't let Israel pass through their territory, and the Israelites just wanted to pass through peacefully, and so these two kings took up arms against the Israelites, and we're told that they fought against the army, the kings, their sons, and the army. And this involved like a 20-mile journey from one river in Moab to another, the Arnon to the Jabbok rivers. And so it's quite an excursion for just an army to travel those 20 miles, let alone women and children. But so you only have adult males mentioned there. And then you have thrown in, when it's recounted in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 3, it says that, look at what we did with kings Sihon and Og, man, woman, young and old, they were utterly destroyed. Well, in that earliest telling, kind of the on-the-ground narrative, there was no mention of women. They were, it was just fighting army to army against army. So what I argue in the book too is that Deuteronomy tends to ramp up the rhetoric and it kind of throws in these rhetorical lines, intensifies the language. Again, even though women and children weren't around. So anyway, there are a number of murky things that and that's pertaining to Numbers 21 and Deuteronomy 3. But again, there are other murky things that I mention in Numbers 31 that again leaves you wondering. Well, it's hard to be definitive here on a lot of these things. So anyway, I leave a few things there. It's a challenging passage, but keep in mind too, there is a greater severity here that's unlike some of the other issues, namely the intentional seduction in order to bring a curse on Israel. Since Balaam couldn't do it one way, he tried to instigate it in another way. And indeed, there is death within Israel because of that as well. So this is of a different nature. So there are a number of factors to bring into the discussion, and so I'm trying to add a little bit more to that discussion through this book.
Yeah, and I would agree. Like, you cover something that I think some apologists don't want to touch, which is the accusation that the Old Testament condoned rape, or
right.
The Midianite women were raped. And like you said,
I have a chapter on that too in this forthcoming book, by the way. The prohibition of war rape, that was not permitted. The whole lifestyle or ethos of Israel, like to go into battle, you had to be sexually pure in order to do so. That you were to abstain from those sorts of things, like David when he goes to, when he takes the sacred bread for his men, he's asked by the priest at Nob, have your men had sexual relations with women? And no, he assures the priest that they haven't, and that's just a standard practice for David. And so there are a number of other passages, the Uriah passage in 2 Samuel 11, etc., that also reinforce that.
Yeah, and for anybody who's going to pick up this book, which I hope the people who watch my video later do consider getting this, like part 1 goes into neo-atheism a little bit, kind of given the thoughts for writing the book. Part 2, God Gracious Monster or Moral Monster. I love these chunks, and it's 4 parts, several chapters. And one thing I don't think people really understand is life in the Near East and how Israel played a part within that. And I love how you chunk that down. what made you decide to add that clarification in with the scripture? Do you feel like that history perspective was needed to help explain better?
Well, could you just clarify the question? I want to make sure, what specific clarification were you saying, or could you just say it again, please?
Okay, let me word it like this. So when you opened up to a big chunk about the Near East, did you do that because you felt like the historical context around would help paint a better light for what the biblical text was doing? Or did you use, I think that might be a good way to ask.
Right. Yeah. And I try to do that in all three of those books, basically trying to bring in some of the ancient Near Eastern context to help clarify that. And also I do that in this. So I did it in the Moral Monster book in particular to try to show what's going on in Israel and how Israel's worldview was one that was much more, it's a far more redemptive worldview that shows concern for the vulnerable, for the alien, the stranger. Other ancient Near Eastern law collections don't really show much concern or even mention, say, those who are foreigners, etc., or have gleaning laws or anything like that, where the poor of the land can take what hasn't been harvested in people's fields, and so I go into a lot more detail on that in this present book. And I not only look at the worldview, but also look at how were law collections understood. And one of the points that I make is that ancient Near Eastern law collections were often just examples of wisdom, but really weren't rooted in actual cases. And there's some carryover to that, like there's a passage of the goring ox in the book of Numbers at the end of Exodus 21, where there are these scenarios related to an ox that gores and what should be done. Well, there's in all of the literature of the ancient Near East, what are called the cuneiform texts and documents, there's only a rare mention of that. And so these are kind of model cases that don't really reflect what has actually happened. So it's not as though this is case law and what is, and precedent and so forth. But these are just giving glimmers of what is prioritized in these ancient Near Eastern cultures and so forth. And when we contrast that to Israel's, we see that Israel's worldview that shines through, and especially through the redemption of the Israelites from Egypt, that they were aliens in the land of Egypt, that they should look out. There's kind of a moral impetus there. So the Mosaic law goes beyond what ancient Near Eastern law collections did by highlighting there's a moral warmth that comes out that has been informed by not only Israel's history in general, but in particular Israel's redemption out of Egypt, and therefore the concern for those who are vulnerable, those who are poor, those who are strangers in the land, to care for them rather than to abuse them. Because remember, you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. There also, there's a much more personalized dimension to the biblical law code or collection, in that it is a personalized relationship between God and his people. It's an I-you relationship, and other ancient Near Eastern covenants during this time didn't have that kind of relationality that is emphasized. So for a number of reasons, I talk about there's a greater moral depth to the Mosaic law. Not perfect. There were laws given because of the hardness of human hearts. And so it's helpful to understand that in context, but also to see that God is actually bringing about a remarkable redemptive change in legislation that far outshines what's going on in other nations, the neighboring nations in the ancient Near East. So those are some things that I talk about. And so I think it is important to bring about those, to mention the ancient Near Eastern context to highlight what some of those differences actually are.
Mm-hmm. And what would you think, like when people, with all the people you encounter, people who have read your book, people in everyday passing, what do you think is the biggest misconception about God in the Old Testament? What's the number one thing that seems to get thrown at you?
Well, I suppose in terms of topics, the topic is warfare in the Old Testament, and women and children and so forth. That's thrown out there, and I think that to a large extent, there's a lot of rhetorical language that's going on there, and I go into special detail on some of those things in this forthcoming book. But I would say the general perception is that the Old Testament God is severe, and that the New Testament God, portrayal of God, is loving, kind, compassionate, a heavenly Father, who's revealed in Jesus, who says, "Turn the other cheek," and who says, Jesus, who says on the cross, "Father, forgive them." So there's that emphasis, but I would say, no, there's actually continuity and carryover into the New Testament. And Paul says in Romans 11:22, he says, "Behold the kindness and severity of God." Behold the kindness and severity of God. That's in both Testaments. And in and God is often most severe with his own people who break covenant repeatedly with him. God is patient. He sends prophets, and finally, when there is no remedy, he brings judgment. So there is, I think, that particular emphasis is lost, but Jesus carries this severity over into the New Testament, and so we see Jesus, who, rather than saying, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing," at the temple, he is driving out money changers and won't let people enter into the temple. So he is acting with just coercive force. In fact, the term violence, or violent, the word, we're familiar with it through modern day geopolitics. The word Hamas is the Hebrew word for violence. And God is not described in the Old Testament as violent. That is wicked human beings who engage in criminal activity and ruthless behavior. But God is not described as violent. He is one who responds to human violence. And so a lot of those forceful verbs that are associated with God, they're not technically described as violence, but God is actually engaging in a kind of counter violence, if you will, that God is responding to what the wickedness of human brutality and so forth, dehumanization, and he's responding to bring an end to it, or maybe just even finish the job, as it were, like with the flood. So there are those types of pictures that we need to understand, that God distances himself from that kind of violence language, but yet there is still a just coercive force that God exerts both in the Old Testament as well as in the New, and Jesus is in the thick of it, not only in the temple, but Jesus promises in the book of Revelation, for example, he's going to cast Jezebel, this false prophetess, on a bed of sickness, and he's going to strike dead her followers. This is Jesus, in red letters, saying these things in Revelation 2:20-23. We also have in the book of Jude, short book, but Jesus' half-brother, Judah, says that Jesus, the best manuscripts have Jesus, not just God, kind of a generic reference, or the Lord. It says Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. Jesus destroyed those unbelieving Israelites. So here you have, if you want to read the Old Testament Christologically, that is, read it through Trinitarian or a Christ-centered lens, here is Jude saying about his loving, compassionate half-brother, Jesus, who died for the sins of the world and said, "Father, forgive them." He was also engaged in severe judgment against the people of Israel for their unbelief. And I could add make other points along those lines, but that's just a little bit of a teaser, because the severity doesn't end with the coming of Jesus. There's again, behold the kindness and severity of God that Paul is reminding in us of in Romans 11:22.
No, that's good. And I just want to remind everybody, the book that we are discussing is God a Moral Monster? And this book took me about 9 hours to read. So there's no way we can fit 9 hours of information into a 30-minute discussion. So I want to encourage everybody, please check this book out. You can get it on Amazon for under $15, and it can be delivered to you tomorrow, according to the website right now. Before we go, what other things do you have going on in the immediate future? I know you're writing this book. Do you do you have like any podcasts coming up, interviews, discussions?
Well, I'm often speaking on various topics through conferences and lectures that I give at various schools and so forth. So I'm about to, now as the fall is approaching and I have a new slate of speaking engagements, I'll be posting those at my website. So you can just look at that, paulcopan.com. And I'll, that should be in the next couple of weeks, some of those updates. So I'll be speaking in Texas. I'll be speaking in Tennessee. I'll be speaking in Massachusetts. So I'll be in a number of different places throughout the academic year. But yeah, I'm also working on a book with InterVarsity Press. It's on 4 views on war and peace. So I'm editing that, and then I'm also, I've contributed to a couple of books on the Old Testament and violence that are coming out later on this year. Helen Paynter, Paynter, is one of the co-editors. She's a co-editor for both of them, the kind of unifying editor for both of those. And that's coming out with Sheffield Phoenix Press. And then also I have I'm contributing a book on the I'm contributing a chapter on the problem of evil to a book on the moral argument. So that's something I'll be chipping away at. But right now, I'm gearing up for the fall semester. We are just starting up a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion at Palm Beach Atlantic University. So Paul Gould and Brandon Rickabaugh are both stellar philosophers, and I'm glad to be teaming up with them as we start our program, our master's program. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out as well. We'd love to have you come and study with us.
No, fantastic. And we got just a couple minutes left. There was one other question, which was a lot of people, especially now in the Christian church, they want to paint a lot of the Old Testament as allegory. What is your knee-jerk reaction when you hear a Christian say, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, that's all allegory?
Well, I would say that the New Testament certainly doesn't treat a lot of what's happening in the Old Testament as allegory. They take these sorts of things as historical events, but even more to the point, a lot of those things that are allegorized, like even or maybe considered myth or the like, would be the book of Exodus and the exiting from the book from the land of Egypt, as well as the Canaanite warfare. A lot of people want to place the dating of, say, Deuteronomy and Joshua, which command or describe what's going on, push them into the 7th century BC, the time of Josiah, which again, basically when the Canaanites really aren't a threat or anything like that. And so there are people like James Hoffmeyer who have talked about, wrote a book, Israel and Egypt, and also another book about Israel in the wilderness and the Exodus. So he has written about the historicity of these events, and that there is a good historical connection that can be made between these things that are often dismissed as not having happened or being mythological or something like that. So, and also in the forthcoming book, look at those questions as well and try to show how that sort of an interpretation is problematic for a number of reasons, and that we can anchor Deuteronomy, the core material in Deuteronomy, as well as what's going on in Joshua, within that say 14th or 13th century BC era, rather than 600 years later.
No, fantastic. So, very simple. If Jesus spoke of this as happening and you're a Christian and you speak of it as not happening, it puts you in a theological problem. Yeah,
and of course you see it going on in the book of Hebrews, that people conquering kingdoms through faith and so on, and Paul, Stephen in Acts 7, Paul in Acts 13, talking about God driving out these Canaanites and so forth. So there's just affirmation after affirmation of these events having taken place, and I'm concerned that a lot of people are dehistoricizing the Old Testament and saying, oh, those historical events like the Exodus, those really aren't crucial for Christian belief, not crucial for our salvation. Okay, the resurrection, okay, that's important, but basically, anything else can go by the wayside in terms of historicity.
Nope, that's a fantastic point to end it on. Once again, thank you all for watching. I get yelled at for not doing this. Please consider liking and subscribing. I'm going to kick the outro, chat with Paul for a quick minute, and then let him go because he is a very busy man.